Leandra Singh gazed up at the towering spires of the Triumvirate's capital city and did her best not to succumb to dismay. It wasn't easy, for the structures seemed to be purposely designed to humble its visitors. The blue and green alien skyscrapers were perfection brought to life, their clean, simple lines giving an almost ethereal impression to humans like herself. Even after all this time, Earth was still unable to match their architecture, and yet these same buildings were incredibly ancient. They were already old, long before the first Egyptian pyramid was built, and yet they gleamed just as brightly as the day they'd been constructed. They were timeless, ageless, awe-inspiring, and the symbol of everything she had grown to hate about this alien land. Admit it, the job is getting to you, she thought to herself, especially today. Once a year, she had the unenviable task of carrying a petition to the highest leaders of the Triumvirate, and as she stepped inside the building and placed her palm against the lift panel, she wondered if this time she'd be able to keep her feelings to herself. Just how many times could you pound your head against the wall in frustration before you simply threw in the towel? The doors slid silently open, beckoning to her as she steeled her resolve and stepped inside. There was no sound as the doors closed behind her, no sense of movement as she was carried to the very top floor of the Ministry Center. It wasn't actually called that, of course. It was merely the closest rendition humans had been able to come up with thus far. There were still subtle nuances they missed here and there, but overall the translation programs did an excellent job. If there was a center of power in the ancient triumvirate, it was here, and the individuals waiting for her were merely the latest holders of an office that stretched back to a time when man wore animal skins and hunted woolly mammoth with flint-tipped spears, a point they made sure mankind was very aware of. The doors slid open once more as she arrived at her destination. The ministers of the triumvirate awaited her in their chamber, as poised and perfect as ever, and as she stepped forward, she regarded each of the three individuals in turn carefully as she mentally prepared herself for her address. The Saurotor minister Lassorth gazed benevolently at her hands folded as she watched her approach with large golden eyes. Her species had a serenity that any human monk would envy, their green pebbled skin covering a shape strongly reminiscent of the centaurs of legend. Her head was broad and ridged, and a trick of the light made it almost seem if she were smiling. Leandra knew better than to take that at face value. In fact, the unfailing politeness known to her people made it even more difficult to accept their decisions. Flanking her was the Ophiptera minister Kamzoi Shah. His transparent dragonfly wings were in constant motion, while his flat snake-like head weaved and twitched as if to music only he could hear. His green conical eyes darted about in search of predators, returning back to her far too often to be anything resembling a hopeful sign. On a raised column between them rested the Ronin minister Sigma 121 sub-delta, as inscrutable as ever, though that was simple enough for a species that resembled a perfectly smooth mirrored sphere. The artificial race had earned its name for the loss of their creators, disappeared millennia ago in some ancient disaster. Their mechanical servants had remained, undergoing their own form of evolution in the years that followed. Leandra came to a halt a respectful distance from the waiting ministers, her head bowed as she greeted them. "Ministers, I bring before you a petition from the Governor-General of Earth, a request to modify our place in triumvirate society and government." Lassorth inclined her head, inviting her to come forward. "We look forward to hearing your petition, Ambassador. Please proceed." She stepped forward, raising her head, the robes of her office swishing about her as began to speak. "In the 90 years since our races first met, mankind has held a probationary status in the triumvirate. We understood your reasons, for we are a young race compared to each of yours. Humanity knew it had much to learn from you, and over the years we have striven to meet the benchmarks for advancement you have laid out for us. With your help, we have abolished war, ended poverty, and taken the first real steps towards the future our species has long dreamed of, and feared would never come. Your guidance has taught us much, though at times the lessons were difficult to accept. And now we stand before you, a race united, asking humbly for the opportunity to stand beside you, not as supplicants, but as equals." Lassorth and Kamzoisha shared a brief glance, though it was, of course, impossible to discern the thoughts of Sigma 121 sub-delta. They danced this dance so many times before, and each knew the steps they were tasked to perform. Yet despite it all, there was still a small part of her that desperately hoped this time it would be different. The Ophiptera's wings buzzed as he turned back to face her. "Your people have indeed come far since we met so many years ago, and we are pleased with the progress you have made. And yet we feel that any change in your status would be premature at this time, since, as you said, you are still a young race. Any human trying to get that sentence out in a single breath would have been left gasping by the effort. But for the minister's race, it was simply the way they spoke, as yet again her hopes were dashed. "May I ask why our petition has been denied?" she asked carefully. "Have we not met every criterion you have demanded of us? What else must we do to gain acceptance among your ranks?" The Ronin minister's neutral-sounding and wholly artificial voice emanated from the column it rested on. "It is illogical to grant your race increased status, Ambassador. There are still disturbing elements to your society that would make any such alteration ill-advised. Despite our best efforts, your people still show an unhealthy attachment to violence and self-destruction." Even though she'd known it was coming, hearing those words went down hard. "Ministers, mankind has not fought a war in our living memory. Each child is screened from before birth for any genetic or biochemical markers that might signal a propensity for violence. We have made the mental health of our people every bit as important as their physical health, and we are monitored for any warning signs throughout our entire lives. So I ask you, ministers, what else must we do?" "All you say is true, Ambassador," Lassorth said gently. "Yet your kind still actively seeks out violence as entertainment. This racial trait concerns us greatly. For why would any sane sapient embrace such an obviously unhealthy form of recreation? The guilds," she sighed inwardly. "It always comes back to the guilds." Channeling mankind's more aggressive impulses into something peaceful had not been an easy task, and for those individuals who found traditional sports too tame for their liking, the guilds had been formed. With elements of both gaming and historical recreation, the guilds offered the masses an outlet that appealed to their baser instincts, and yet was about as dangerous as tiddlywinks. Battles were fought within the safe confines of computers, and the yearly finals drew as much, if not more, excitement as the World Cup. It was safe, it was harmless, and for the triumvirate, it was proof humans were just as bloodthirsty as they'd always been. "Minister, I submit our choices of recreation should have no bearing on our petition," Leandra replied through a clenched jaw. "There is no actual conflict, and no one is harmed. It is mere competition, nothing more. Ambassador, what you see as a harmless activity, we view as a symptom of some deeper pathology, which makes it impossible for us to grant your species the license it seeks, though you should not be disheartened by this and use our criticisms not as denunciation, but as a guide for self-improvement. Zoisha managed to get out, as she fought to keep her own temper in check, which would only prove their point for them. Ministers, she finally managed to get out. We are not you. It is discriminatory to judge us by these kinds of arbitrary standards written long ago without taking into consideration our unique characteristics. If you simply give us a chance, we'd be honored to prove it to you." Even though she'd known the odds were slim of them granting Earth's petition, actually hearing the words out loud tore at her. "As you yourself stated, humanity has indeed made great strides since our first encounter," Sigma 121 Subdelta said in measured tones. "But you seek to claim a privilege you are not yet ready to wield. In time, it is our hope that you will be, but that day is not yet here." 12 times she'd personally come before this body to make this same request, and 12 times she'd been refused. Others had stood on this same spot before her, and others would come after. And all the while the triumvirate dangled a carrot in front of them, one she had long suspected they would never willingly relinquish. Despite her best efforts to remain calm, their condescending words dug into her flesh. Easy for them to call themselves evolved and mature. The Sorotors and Ophiptera were herbivores, and the Ronin were machines. There was no way mankind was ever going to meet those impossible standards. "Might as well be hanged for a sheep as a lamb," she thought with a cold smile. "From the day we met, you've looked down at us," Leandra said with quiet fury. "You've sneered at our savage nature, insinuated we're little more than half-evolved apes, and every time we've done as you asked, as you demanded, you've moved the goalposts." Lassorth and Zoisha looked at her with sudden alarm, drawing back from her anger. "You sit behind your planetary shields, safe and secure, and dare to judge us for having to claw our way out of the muck. And what have you become?" A sneer appeared on her face, even though in some recess of her mind she knew she was feeding their fears. It didn't matter. She'd been bottling it up for far too long, and nothing was going to stop her from letting it out now. Stagnant, static, torpid. You haven't made a scientific advancement in 1,000 years, and you haven't colonized a new world in 3,000. Your population has been slowly declining for centuries, and yet here you sit, impugning us. Leandra knew she was busily talking herself right out of a job, but she no longer cared. It felt too damn good. You built yourselves a utopia, she charged on, as the ministers seemed to be searching for a means to escape her wrath, and you've pissed it away. We would give anything to have just the smallest piece of what you've built, and yet you still deny us any technology beyond the most basic. Just how long to expect us to be your whipping boy before we finally cry enough? Her chest heaved as she finally ran out of invective to hurl, her nostrils flaring and face flushed with adrenaline. The herbivores were utterly terrified, unable to speak, but the machine suffered no such qualms. Your outburst is the most convincing proof of all that your species is not yet ready, Sigma 121 Subdelta said calmly. If you are unable to contain your emotions, how can you possibly claim equal status? Your entire argument collapses under its own weight, Ambassador. The Ronin were famous for having no emotions, but Leandra could hear the gloating in its voice. You're right, Minister, she said at last. We're not your equals. The red-hot anger that had been running through her veins only moments before had been replaced with something much colder and crueler. We're better, Leandra hissed, before turning on her heels and storming out of the chamber, leaving chaos in her wake. Acolyte Nassat knelt before the symbolic flame, his fore and hind legs tucked in close as he bowed his head in meditation. The Saurotor faith was a simple one, focused on quiet contemplation, and for those that chose the ascetic life, their days were filled with seeking answers to the great truths from within. Did one choose their path, or did fate decide? Is reality something that can be measured, or is it merely an illusion? The internal debates that went to the core of their faith did not come easily to him, but he was determined to find the serenity he saw on the visages of the older monks. Is morality constant, Acolyte, or is it a reed in the wind? He heard behind him, pulling him out of his thoughts. Nassat turned to see the venerable Ishre regarding him with hooded eyes as he struggled to answer the question. It is constant, honored venerable, he replied, after a moment's reflection. A morality that bows to outside forces is not morality, but corruption. The elder monk drew himself up. Defend your position, he challenged. Nassat swallowed nervously. Morality is a doctrine that guides us to help us choose good from evil, he said carefully. Good does not cease to be good simply because one's circumstances change, nor does evil cease to be evil. An outside force may demand otherwise, but that does not alter truth. He looked up hopefully, praying his answer was the correct one. The older monk smiled. Quite so, young acolyte. Truths are eternal and inviolable. They are the amassed wisdom of millennia, tested and proven again and again. To think otherwise based on a whim is corruption indeed. The young acolyte smiled in return, his hide rippling with the pleasure of his master's approval, when an odd thought entered his mind. Master, what if new data was found? Some new truth we had not known before? Could that alter morality? The venerables smiled, disappeared instantly. And what supposed truth do you think we have not yet discovered, young Nassat? Wiser minds than yours have searched for answers since the beginning of our history, and if such truth was waiting to be found, it would have already been found. He sniffed derisively at the still prostrate male, who immediately bowed his head once more. Forgive my impertinence, honored venerable, Nassat said quickly. I ask only because we are taught to question. Does that not mean there are still truths to be learned? You are taught to question to learn those truths, Ishre said coldly, to internalize them and make them your own, not to question the collective wisdom of all those who have gone before. Or do you believe you are more enlightened than they? Nassar's head bowed even deeper. Of course not, honored venerable, he whispered. The monk glared at him and then jerked his head towards the doorway. Assist in preparing the evening meal, he commanded, and while you do, reflect on your transgression. Yes, honored venerable, Nassat replied immediately as he lumbered to his feet and scurried away before he incurred even more penalties. But as he made his way to the kitchens, his mind kept returning to the monk's reaction. He'd simply asked a question. Why was his reaction so severe? A soft chime announced an incoming call as Leandra looked up from the report she'd been perusing only to blink in surprise when she spied the Governor General's official seal on her screen. She took a brief moment to tuck an errant wisp of hair behind her ear and take a calming breath before pressing the accept button on the comm. Governor, this is indeed an honor, she said politely, as an elder male with silver hair looked back at her. Ambassador Singh? Governor Granville nodded. I've just received a comm from the Triumvirate Ministry. It seems your recent visit made quite the impression. He gazed at her coolly, with no hint as to his thoughts or emotional state. Leandra stifled a sigh as she nodded slowly in return. I was just finishing my report, sir, she said quietly. I'm afraid I let my emotions get the better of me, and for that you have my deepest apologies. Granville didn't answer immediately, letting the silence draw out as she fought the urge to fidget in her seat. Sir, she said at last, if you desire my resignation, you'll have it within the hour. The governor let her stew a bit longer before finally shaking his head. That won't be necessary, he said at last. To be honest, I've been expecting this. Her eyes widened in surprise. You have? For some time now, in fact, he replied, as a ghost of a smile finally appeared on his face. Leandra, you've lasted longer as ambassador than any of your predecessors. Did you ever wonder why? The question caught her off guard, but as she turned it over in her mind, she found herself curious. Not until now, sir, she answered. I guess I'd always assumed they had simply moved on to other positions. They did, but that wasn't the reason why they all eventually resigned, Granville said with a shrug. Sooner or later, they were all overwhelmed with the sheer futility of the post, he said apologetically. The triumvirate hasn't budged a centimeter in 10,000 years on any subject. Even acknowledging us was a huge change in their policy, and it wouldn't have happened at all if we hadn't literally landed on their doorstep. The exploration vessel that stumbled onto the triumvirate had suffered a mechanical failure and was forced to divert and make repairs. Earth would have found them sooner or later. The size and location of their region of space made that inevitable, but the first meeting was a complete accident. Leandra slowly nodded in agreement. Nothing ever changes with them. I make my petitions, and they ignore them. I guess I hadn't realized how deeply it was affecting me until this last meeting. I understand, the Governor General replied. They can be downright infuriating at times, and if it wasn't for the technology they've shared, we would have walked away from the table years ago. He leaned forward, looking at her. I can offer you another post, perhaps a cabinet position on Zion? That's a very generous offer, sir, Leandra said, in something of a daze. She'd been dreading this conversation, certain she would be facing his wrath. To discover he was anything but displeased with her was quite the reprieve. May I have some time to consider my options? Take all the time you need, he smiled. I need to start screening candidates for your replacement anyway. If you have any recommendations, of course I'd be happy to entertain them. I have a short list, she smiled. I'll forward it to you immediately. I look forward to reading it, he answered. Let me know what you decide. Granville, clear. The screen went blank as he ended the transmission. Leandra leaned back in her chair and fingered her necklace. It was certainly a tempting offer. As one of Earth's older colonies, Zion would be a step up, and a nice addition to her resume. It was a shame in some ways to leave the ambassador post, but the Governor General was right. Nothing ever changed in the triumvirate. A cold wind swept across the barren landscape as a lone warrior made his way up the small hill to the place of skulls. His path was lined with the chieftains of 1,000 clans, each bearing a torch as they waited in silence. Though their technology had advanced steadily over the long, bitter years, this place was sacred. Their distant ancestors had first landed here, little more than starving refugees on broken ships, falling to their knees and rejoicing that the fates had granted them even one more day of life. Dakik was a harsh world, demanding much from those that called it home. Only the strong survived here, and yet it had shaped his people as surely as a stone will hone a blade. A vow had been made in this place, so very long ago, and as time marched on, the people of the Kheem race prepared themselves for the day when that vow would be fulfilled. Diaksh Jiaj Guyas reached the top of the craggy tor and slowly turned to face the waiting horde. His nostrils took in the acrid air, his jet-black eyes gazing at those surrounding him, old allies and foes alike. He bore the scars of countless battles, and as his fingers absently caressed the worn dagger at his hip, a thin smile of triumph appeared on his lips. Countless ages ago, our forebears made a pact, he intoned to the silent crowd. They were beaten, defeated no more than the ragged remnants of a once proud race. Hounded from their lands, fleeing with nothing but the cloth on their backs, watching in sorrow as their families were torn from their grasp and left to perish. This we remember. We remember, the horde chanted in reply. Those that survived the dark years passed the tale to their children, and to their children's children, he continued. They vowed that one day they would take back what was theirs, to avenge those whose lives were stolen. Jiaj took a moment to let the crowd reflect, before he continued. But the Kheem were few in number, struggling to survive, so it was up to their descendants to fulfill the vow. They charged their progeny to prepare for that sacred day, to hone their skills, and become even greater than they had once been. This we remember. We remember, the horde replied. And in the fullness of time, fate smiled upon the Kheem, he said with pride. Our numbers grew, our children lived and thrived, and it was good. Jiaj paused once more as his features darkened. But the people forgot their vow, turned their back on the promise of their ancestors. They became scientists and teachers and walked the path of peace. Fate saw the Kheem falter and weaken, allowing themselves to become soft and without honor. So fate intervened once again and sent to us the flaming star, the rock from the heavens. It smashed into this world and brought us pain and sorrow. This we remember. We remember, the horde said once more. And so we began again. But this time, we did not forsake our vow. The path of peace led to our downfall, so instead, we chose the path of war. Clan warred against clan, tribe against tribe, brother against brother, and each generation that followed grew stronger than the last. Our people have been to the fire, felt the smith's hammer as it shaped us, all to prepare us for the day when we would honor the vow. He searched the crowd, his gaze landing on a grizzled warrior with a single remaining eye. Jiaj lifted his hand and pointed him out. Mobhoot and I have faced each other in battle countless times. I have tasted his blade, and he mine. The older man nodded in agreement, returning his unwavering look. And yet today, I call Mobhoot my kinsman. For today, we are all kinsmen. A hungry growl began to grow amongst the horde as they listened eagerly. For today, this day we fulfill our forebears' vow. This day we mount our ships and return to our ancient lands. This day we take back what was ours. Diaksh Jiash Guyaz, the chosen leader of his people, pulled his dagger from its sheath and raised it to the sky. This day, who remind those that tried to destroy us that we have not forgotten our vow for, we remember. We remember, the horde screamed as they raised their own blades to the heavens, the howling winds carrying their promise across the land. Phi Prime, After 57, sent out a mental command to one of the positron collectors in stationary orbit over the microquasar, ordering it back to the storage facility. The triumvirate had long been based on matter-antimatter annihilation as an energy source, but even for their advanced technology, creating antimatter was still a labor-intensive process with little reward. It was far simpler to simply mine for the valuable substance, and the best location to find any measurable amount was in the two jet streams radiating from the microquasar located on the edge of triumvirate space. There were smaller harvesting facilities elsewhere, but the Giayam microquasar was by far their most productive site. The collector dutifully began its journey back to storage, crossing paths with its replacement. The high-energy jets were incredibly destructive, and the collectors could survive their onslaught for only very brief periods before needing to be replaced. The entire operation was completely automated, with the exception of Phi Prime C-57, though given the nature of the Ronins that could be argued either way. It was far too hazardous an environment for mere flesh and blood, so by long tradition, a rotating corps of Ronin assumed responsibility for the operation. The job required lightning-fast reflexes and attention to detail, areas in which the mechanical Ronin excelled. On rare occasions, it would transfer its sphere to one of the various automatons involved with the collection process to handle operations directly, but other than that, it was a tedious and routine assignment. A proximity alarm suddenly clamored for its attention. It was far too early for its replacement to be arriving on station, so Phi Prime Baki 57 diverted some of its attention to the signal. Multitasking was also one of its racial abilities, but when it examined the source of the signal more closely, it found itself at an unheard-of loss for words. A fleet of ships had been detected in the vicinity, and on closer inspection, they were of a type completely unknown to the Triumvirate's databanks. A new race, perhaps? Phi Prime Thirsty 57 sincerely hoped that wasn't the case. Even though it had been almost a century since they had met the humans from Earth, they were still struggling to find a way to accommodate the fledgling species. There was a rather vocal minority, one that Phi Prime Thi 57 found itself in agreement with, that believed the Triumvirate would be much better off sending the humans packing. Their technology was primitive in the extreme, and their culture even more troubling. Their history of violence made them a poor fit in its opinion, but the minority faction had been overruled. These ships were definitely not Terran or Triumvirate, so that begged the question what they were, and what its response should be. Should it attempt a greeting? Gather data unobtrusively? Sadly, the one thing it could not do was send a message by comm back to the Ministry. The microquasar's emissions played merry havoc with the Ansible faster-than-light system, but it did have another method it could use. Phi Prime the 57 had a number of message drones available, but they would likely be detected by the unknown ships if they were sent back home. The system updated its information, and Phi Prime The 57 realized with an uneasy feeling that was a moot point. A number of the ships had broken off the main body and were now heading his way, and it realized grimly just how unlikely it was they were, just dropping by for a friendly visit. First contact with the humans had been with a single ship, not an armada, and with that acknowledgement, the decision became a simple one. It took less than a second to upload its sensor data into the message drone, and moments later its engine was brought online and sent roaring off to triumvirate territory. Phi Prime Purdy 57 watched in disbelief as one of the ships casually destroyed the drone less than 2 minutes later, killing it with an immensely powerful energy beam. 1,000 possible scenarios raced through its electronic mind, and sadly, they all ended the same way. Still, there was something else it could try. Once again, it uploaded its data, but this time, it sent all its drones herring away, each in a different direction. It would be all but impossible for the alien fleet to intercept each and every one of them, ensuring that at least some of them would make it back. The alien fleet reacted instantly, its ships splitting off in pursuit. They must have guessed their purpose, and were determined that no message be sent back to the ministry. More beams slashed out, and one by one the drones blinked out of existence, until the last one disappeared from its sensors. It took Phi Prime G 57 several seconds to accept what its sensors were saying after all. At least one should have gotten through. That every single one of its drones were now destroyed shook its confidence to the core, and several more minutes ticked by before it attempted one final tactic of desperation. Focusing its comm system on the nearest vessel, it beamed a message on maximum gain. Unknown ship, this is triumvirate space. We are not a threat to you and request a chance to speak. Please respond. 20 minutes later, Prime 57 received a reply, as half a dozen ships blew it into component atoms. Leandra Singh stood on the balcony of the embassy, staring up at the sky. The sun had just finished setting, and as she gazed out over the alien city, the first stars began to appear, distorted as always by the planet's shield. She'd never really gotten used to the sight, and seeing them unfiltered once more was one of the things she looked forward to when she assumed her new post on Zion. No date had been set, as the candidates for her replacement were still being vetted, but she had every confidence that Governor General Granville would see it was handled quickly and efficiently. A polite cough behind her pulled her from her reverie, turning to spot her assistant Amadeo Rees holding a pad and wearing a polite smile. Madam Ambassador, the latest update for Earth, he told her, indicating the tablet. She waved him over and took the device from his hands, giving it an almost cursory glance before affixing her signature and handing it back. See that it goes out immediately, she told him, as she once again turned her sights to the alien sky. Yes, ma'am, he nodded, tucking the tablet back under his arm. Will there be anything else? No, not tonight, she answered, before giving him a wry look. It won't be long before you'll be breaking in a new ambassador, she said with a smirk. Riza chuckled. I'm sure we'll find a way to muddle through, ma'am, he replied, before pausing. Madam Ambassador, may I be blunt? He asked in suddenly serious tones. She looked at him quizzically. Of course, Amadeo. What's on your mind? The dark-haired man took a moment to respond. Ma'am, I just wanted to say that it's been a pleasure serving with you, and that I understand why you've decided to move on. You may not want to hear this right now, but I believe you've done a lot of good during your tenure. Leandra snorted. I didn't make so much as a dent, not after 12 years, she said derisively. The Triumvirate have created their perfect little society, and absolutely nothing is allowed to rock the boat. Her features softened slightly as she regarded him. But thank you for your kind words. I beg to differ, ma'am, he said sincerely. I believe the ministers were beginning to listen to you. They simply couldn't bring themselves to accept it. He shrugged, sparing a brief moment to glance into the sky. Their entire culture, their entire history, for that matter, is wrapped around the central tenet they have created the perfect society. Their minds simply weren't able to accept any data that conflicted with that. He spread his hands out in an almost Gallic gesture before cocking his head in curiosity. You know, something has always puzzled me. Oh? What's that? Leandra asked him. He pointed up at the night sky, at the odd greenish overcast at the distorted stars. Their planetary shields? Why do they even need them? Are they that fearful of meteorites? She paused for a moment before looking back up as well. You know, we've never really gotten a good answer to that, she admitted. They've been there so long, I'm not sure they even remember why they were created in the first place. Amadeo chuckled. They're hardly alone in that. Did you ever hear the story about the flower of Catherine the Great? Leandra stared at him in confusion. A flower? No, I don't think so. His grin grew wider. According to the legend, Otto von Bismarck was visiting the Tsar's summer palace in St. Petersburg while serving as the Prussian ambassador. One day he happened to notice a guard standing watch in the middle of a meadow. Being a military officer, he knew there was no reason for a sentry to be posted in that spot, so he made inquiries, and everyone he asked said the same thing. We have always had a guard posted there. His eyes twinkled with delight as he waited for her reaction. The ambassador tried to play it off, but finally curiosity got the better of her. All right, I'll bite. Why was a guard posted in the middle of a meadow? Her assistant chuckled once again. They finally managed to track down an old pensioner who recalled a story told to him by his father when he was a boy. It seemed that Catherine the Great was on a walk one day when she spotted a daffodil, the first one that spring. She ordered a guard posted there so no one would trample it. He paused for dramatic effect, 100 years earlier. She stared at him in disbelief before a giggle broke free. The more she tried to stifle it, the worse it got, until finally there were tears in her eyes as she staggered against the railing in fits of laughter. Amadeo laughed right along with her until she was able to get herself back under control again. Oh, that's perfect, she snickered. Do you think it's actually true? Rieza grinned once more. I don't know. I hope it is. There's something about the sheer absurdity of it that appeals to my belief in the perverse nature of the universe. Leandra wiped her eyes before placing a hand on his arm. Thank you, she told him. I needed that. Any time, Madam Ambassador, he smiled, holding up the tablet. I'll send this out immediately. Amadeo gave her a brief, polite bow. Good night, ma'am. Good night, she replied, as he disappeared back the way he'd came, leaving her alone with her thoughts once more. Part of her would miss this place, she was forced to admit, but she was already looking forward to the views of Zion. Diaksh Giaj Guyaz stood on the bridge of the flagship Oathkeeper, filled with pride as he looked out at the fleet. They had drawn first blood, and while the engagement had been brief, it had also been eminently satisfying. The fleet had responded quickly to the flurry of unmanned craft, quickly dispatching them before they were able to escape, allowing them to retain the advantage of surprise. They would not be able to keep their presence a secret forever, of course, but as long as they could, he had every intention of using it to maximum effect. He could sneak into the enemy's camp like a thief in the night, hitting one isolated outpost after another, but the warrior within rejected that option immediately. They hadn't fired a single weapon in retaliation, not one. And if that was true on the fringes of his territory, what awaited them if they struck at the adversary's very heart? A cold smile appeared on his face as he turned to his helmsman. What is the distance to the nearest core world? The helmsman took a moment to check his display. We could be there in less than 2 days' time, Diaksh. Then do so, he commanded, as the fleet adjusted course. Soon, his mind whispered, soon you will taste my blade. Soon you will know real fear.